The history of Native Americans as we know it is based on accounts written by Europeans who invaded North America in the 15th century. Although this account suffices, historians have shown that it is an understatement of the state of the continent thousands of years before Columbus accidentally bumped into the Caribbean islands. At this time, Europeans thought they were the only ones flourishing. Therefore, they thought of themselves as better than everyone else. However, when Columbus landed on the continent of North America, which was inhabited by over 20 million natives, the state of the continent blew his mind. Nothing had prepared the Europeans for the complexity they encountered. Welcome to the Told You Another Story channel. In today's video, we'll be talking about the mysterious lives of Native Americans before the Europeans arrived. The continent of North America was filled with hundreds of Native Americans. Therefore, it was pretty diverse, not just in terms of culture, but also in terms of cultivation. Most of the crops cultivated in modern America have been cultivated centuries before the Europeans arrived on the continent. The natives were flourishing. However, the life of a Native American in those times was anything but perfect. They faced problems such as pandemics, natural disasters, and tribal wars, which led to the loss of lives and properties. In the years leading up to Columbus's arrival, the continent faced a large degree of violence and hardships, which caused long-lasting effects, some of which are still being dealt with today. Before the advent of these issues, the population of the natives was initially higher than we were led to believe. Before the Europeans arrived in America, the continent housed over 100 million people, and the first natives to settle in the continent migrated over 15,000 years ago. After the European invasion, their population drastically reduced, which is accredited to the lifestyle of the locals at the time. Historians believe that more than tribal conflicts, pandemics, and natural disasters contributed greatly to the decline in their population. Another culture shock the Europeans experienced in the Americas was how advanced their civilization was. This was a huge shock because the foreigners thought they were from the most advanced society at the time, and they were greatly surprised by the cultural advancement and settlement range among the ethnic groups. Because of the region's demographics, especially Mesoamerica, where most of the technology came from, most of their innovations could not be spread outside the area. Their technology might have seemed primitive, but it served them better than the so-called improvements the Europeans arrived with. For example, the natives frowned against the use of guns because they thought they were too loud and had less shooting range than the arrows they were used to. Another interesting fact about the life of the pre-Columbian natives was the fact that they were already masters in artificial selection. Today, much of the variety of corn we're familiar with is all thanks to the genius of the Native Americans. Initially, corn was produced from inedible grass, but native farmers genetically modified this weed through selective breeding to produce wide varieties of corn. Some Native American technology was so great, they were preferred even by the Europeans to the ones they came with. For example, the natives wore moccasins which were more comfortable than the footwear of the Europeans. They were created with more padding, which made them perfect for hunting and war, because those who wore them were able to move very quietly. Also, their canoes were faster and could maneuver better than European boats. Amidst all this advancement, the Native Americans were plagued by the problem of violence. They were involved in conflicts that produced ugly results, so bad that some native tribes were completely wiped out as a result of these petty wars. The million-dollar question, however, is, why did the Native Americans lead such dangerous lives? To understand the answer to this question, we need a little backstory. One of the biggest contributors to the problem of violence among the Native American communities was how different they were from each other. There were hundreds of Native American tribes which barely had anything in common. It was just as difficult for the Seminoles and Mohawks to communicate as it would be for Germans and the French, because of how different they were. They didn't always get along. Contrary to popular belief, not all Native Americans were peaceful, and some of these conflicts led to the loss of lives and property. Native American tribes often had disputes with one another over matters like land settlement, fur trade, and so on. They lived like this for thousands of years before the Europeans settled in, and their presence didn't exactly change much about the situation at hand, but it didn't seem that way in the beginning. One of the earliest interactions of the natives with foreigners was the first Thanksgiving dinner. It was a peaceful meal over which two different cultures bonded and displayed solidarity. A couple of years beforehand, the natives had saved the pilgrims by teaching them how to survive in the unfamiliar terrain of Plymouth Colony. They were unable to farm and survive the cold, and the natives taught them a few survival skills. Despite the graciousness of the Native Americans, almost 90% of the pilgrims did not survive the harsh conditions. The Wampanoag tribe taught those who were left how to hunt, fish, fertilize the soil, and grow corn. These lessons were the reason the settlers could live long enough to participate in that first Thanksgiving celebration. Despite the appearance of peace between the two cultures, there was a brewing conflict which became one of the earliest and most violent of the conflicts, the Pequot conflict. Overall, the conflict between the Pequots and the Europeans was caused by a competition between both groups to control the fur and wampum trade in colonial Connecticut. As the conflicts intensified, other tribes began to pick sides. For example, the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes sided with the foreigners who had bought their support. The Pequot suffered the greatest hit and ultimately lost the war. In 1637, the colonial forces burned a Pequot fort to the ground, located in what is now Mystic, Connecticut. In true colonist fashion, nothing stopped them from getting what they wanted, and it didn't even matter that there were 500 Pequots inside the fort. Only 14 people survived, and those that escaped were hunted and killed or sold into slavery. Only a few were lucky enough to hold on to their lives, and they integrated with the Mohawk tribe. Ultimately, the Pequot nation was dissolved. Although their fight seemed territorial on the surface, some historians believed that the colonists had a different motive. Some extremely pious colonists believed that the Native Americans were representatives of the Antichrist, and therefore resolved to eliminate them completely. This would explain the extreme lengths the colonists went to during the course of the conflict. Another dark part of Native American history was the practice of revenge blood. Like most things the native did, there was a deep spiritual reason behind this practice. The idea behind it was that if one Native American ended the life of another, the victim's family members had the right and social obligation to do the same to any member of the perpetrator's family. Interestingly, this practice was upheld by society's respect for the act of retaliation. Although this sounds very savage, it wasn't as far as the blood revenge could go. There were times when the endless cycle of revenge resulted in what was called the Morning War. This Morning War often happened between and within different clans and tribes. It was popular among the Iroquois in the 15th century, and it wasn't until they suffered so much loss that the clan leaders decided to abolish the practice of blood revenge. The topic of how peaceful the natives were before the European invasion is still debatable. Some people argue that the colonists triggered the natives so much that they became extremely violent, and others argue that North America was already a violent place when the colonists landed on the Caribbean shores. There are elements of truth in both territories, and although the pre-Columbian state of the continent is up for debate, it is a fact that the colonists left the Native Americans in a more horrible state. In the coming years, the natives who were indigenous of the island were separated and considered second-class citizens. When the U.S. was formed in 1776, the colonists made treaties with the natives, all of which were not respected. The natives were forced to live in the shadow of foreigners, became victims of racism in their own homeland, and were secluded to live in the worst parts of the country. The experiences of the Native Americans, especially at the hands of the colonists, were cruel and unnecessary. The foreigners not only gave inaccurate accounts of their history, but also made them become aliens in their own land. Today, Native American tribes are still classified as minority ethnic groups, but their experiences are significantly more favorable than that of their ancestors. Thank you for watching. Hit us up in the comments section and give us a thumbs up if you liked the video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos.